This is RadPod, a podcast produced by ASMRT, the Australian Society of Medical Imaging and Radiation Therapy. ASMRT acknowledges the Boonwurrung people as the traditional owners of the land from which we record this podcast and pays respect to elders past and present. Hello, I'm Steve Lacey and I'm the Director of Education for ASMRT. If you're in Australia, any medical radiation professional, student, or those teaching professions at university would be very familiar with the Medical Radiation Practitioners Board of Australia's, or the MRPBA, Professional Capabilities for medical radiation practice. Now, these are the minimum knowledge, skills, and professional attributes that are needed for safe and competent practice as a medical radiation practitioner in Australia. It's really what all stakeholders should expect for safe and effective professional practice. These capabilities were first created in 2013 and they were updated early in 2020, but now the time has come to update them once again as our health workforce needs change as technology evolves. The new capabilities have recently been released, coming into effect on March the 30th, 2026. And to talk about the updates today, I'm joined by Cara Miller. So Cara is the current chair of the MRPBA and also has a background as a radiographer and sonographer. Welcome to RadPod, Cara.
Thanks, Steve. It's so good to be here and it's so lovely to have the invitation to join you here on RadPod. Be great to talk to you.
Good, thank you. Before we get into these updates, can I just ask you, what's the purpose of actually having these standards in the first place?
Absolutely. The professional standards are really the minimum expectations that the board sets for the profession, as well as the community expectation of the profession as well. And it's important to note on the word minimum, and that's because it's necessary to set a minimum threshold standard that ensures safe practice and doesn't create risk, not only to the practitioners, but more importantly to the public. It also identifies the skills, the knowledge and the attributes that are absolutely necessary to play part into that practice and safe, effective service delivery. And certainly it's all sometimes a bit of a lag, our professional capabilities, because the standards are expected to evolve over time as the profession evolves over time, and particularly with things that we see in medical radiation practice around, technology advancements and community expectations.
Yeah, and just to be clear, the standards are there for the safety of the public. They're not there to protect the individual radiographer or radiation therapist or anything like that. They're there for the protection of the patient.
That is absolutely correct. The board's role is about title protection. It is not about defining scopes of practice. And that is to define, as a medical radiation practitioner, what's expected in that professional to deliver the services of the profession so that the public feels safe for those services that they are actually receiving.
Yeah, great. So why do we need to update them then? Well, what was wrong with the initial ones that we had?
We've seen a huge amount of change over a decade. If we think about practice 10 years ago and where we sit today, things like digital health and AI are now coming, forefront, as well as community expectations and things like our ability to provide culturally safe practice for our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So there has been an evolution, and the professional capabilities has to also evolve, because when we think about the public safety, we have to marry that up. We have to marry the advancement of the profession, which is fantastic, and the professional capabilities needs to keep contemporary with that so that the public are safe when they're having services by a medical radiation practitioner.
Yeah, and I'm sure that it will continue to evolve as the profession evolves as well, which means that they'll need to be updated again in a few years' time, right?
Absolutely.
I bet you can't wait for that either.
Surely.
So the new capabilities have recently been made public, and let's get into some of these updates. Now, I've noted quite a few things in there, such as anaphylaxis, digital health, student support. But the biggest thing that I've noticed is that there's actually an extra domain. So that's domain 6. So tell us about this one.
Oh, this is fantastic. This is really nothing new in the profession. We just created a domain around leadership and stewardship. And that's really to reflect that the profession is also a technically based profession in most cases, but it also has advancement in how the public actually perceive us as a profession. Mm-hmm. And it is a biggie, but it is just a word. It's not about a hierarchy. Leadership is not a position in a team. Leadership as a practice is a set of behaviours. And when we think about those behaviours, I think of things like curiosity, research, collaboration, ethical integrity, sustainability. These are all qualities of leadership, and it shouldn't be seen as something that sits high because you've got career experience. We see that leadership in a medical radiation practitioner is for everyone.
I think that a lot of people think about the word leadership as more of a senior role, such as management modality supervisor, clinical educator, or something like that. So I think to be clear, we really need to basically be able to define what leadership actually is. And so for someone such as, say, a student or a graduate or an early career person, what does leadership actually mean for them?
Absolutely. And I'd like to call out the Great ASMET conference in 2025, where I had the privilege of being part of a panel discussion in the student conference. And that was leadership in action, where you saw the students actually presenting papers that were about curiosity. They were about research. They were about analysis and analytics. And they were drawing them back to the profession and their roles. And I was completely gobsmacked with the calibre of papers that were coming through the student conference. And that is leadership. That is actually looking at things in a different light. And we need that in every level of generation of our career journey. And graduates and students and early practitioners in their early years bring a different set of observations to the profession. And that can be leadership.
Yeah. Do you think perhaps that the word leadership should have been a different word then? Given that there has been that level of confusion amongst people thinking that leadership is something else, do you think that leadership should have been a different word?
Absolutely not. Leadership is the right word. And when we come back to public expectation, public actually expects a medical radiation practitioner to be a leader in their profession. They're looking to them for support, advice, professional expertise, all those skills, knowledge and attributes. They're looking at them to be iterative to the needs of those individual patients. They are leadership qualities. But in the background, we want registered practitioners to take ownership of their journey and think about, what does leadership look like for them personally? And that is different for everyone. It is not a blanket definition. Leadership can be someone who really is passionate about an area that they explore and do research in, and that might lead to changes in protocols. That's leadership. So leadership is the right word, and we have laboured this quite a lot at the board, and we've considered a great amount of feedback. And the more and more we thought about it, and the more and more we discussed it, and the more and more we spoke to stakeholders, leadership is the right word.
Okay, well, thanks for clarifying that.
I'm passionate.
I can tell. So let's think about it from the perspective now of the clinical educators out there who are putting together their education program for their staff, for their students. What's the expectation on them of incorporating this domain into their education program?
I think that when those educators look at their programs, they're going to see it there already. You know, if you are looking at, it could be research projects, opportunities for curiosity and critical analysis. It could be case studies. It could be observational audits in clinical practice. And what does that mean? This is open for any interpretation because leadership is not in a box. So I feel like clinical educators and programs are already going to have rich content that will meet the Domain 6 leadership.
Okay. Another big change that I've noticed is the clarification of expectations for recognising and responding to patient deterioration and the requirement for anaphylaxis management. And this has actually been a huge topic of conversation. Can you tell us about this change?
Yeah, this has been driven over a number of years. It really came to an important level with the Peter Hickey coronial inquest, and that has been well reported and has been the topic of many of ASMERT's presentations at conferences. But that was just one of the elements. But there was recommendations from that coronial inquest around ensuring that the professional capabilities actually did meet the requirements for medical radiation practitioners to be able to respond to anaphylaxis. So when we think about responding to anaphylaxis and deterioration, we do need to look at how we deliver that with things like administration of adrenaline. So that was probably the big case that brought this into the capabilities.
So does this mean that everyone then will be required to be trained in anaphylaxis management by March the 30th?
Absolutely. Obviously, when we bring in a new capability, there'll be a short window where we will allow people who are already undertaking a program or are enrolled in a program to be able to actually meet that requirement. The fallback for those who are not able to meet it on the 30th of March is still your code of conduct around being capable to be able to deliver on those capabilities. So if you are not able to deliver on that, then you will need to, as a registered practitioner, make sure that you're aware of that limitation and in your scope, and you need to then make sure that you've got systems in place to be able to meet it. And that might be working with your employer, making sure that you're enrolled, ensuring that you've got additional staff around you should that need arise in your place of practice.
Yeah. And for those who don't have this training as part of their current workplace requirements, how and where could they look for that training? And I'm thinking more for the larger hospitals, it's a relatively, dare I say it, a simple process for them. because a lot of other people have it as part of their scope of practice. But I'm thinking about the people that work for those small private practices and that don't really have that type of support. Where can they actually look for that training?
Yeah, look, there's information on our website, and a big shout out to ASMRT as well. You've got an amazing program. And from what I've heard, we're seeing people that are coming out feeling really confident post your training, as well as actually that is delivered in a really awesome way. So there are other resources. I know that the Australasian Society of Clinical Immunology and Allergy run programs. So there are resources out there, and it has been communication since November to practitioners to get out there, have a look, try and find out where you can get the training, speak with your employer, and if there's any problems, reach out to us.
And I will also just mention that the asthma anaphylaxis training is actually going to move to an online format at some point in 2026.
You've answered my question then.
So part of this requirement might be the requirement to then administer adrenaline. What are MRPs allowed to or not allowed to do?
Yeah, that's right. So obviously the use of adrenaline is within the scope of practice for a medical radiation practitioner. But the second part is they have to be appropriately trained. And the third layer of complexity is around the different states and territories' drugs and poisons legislation. So each practitioner has to understand what is their possible, capable and is legally required in their jurisdiction. That's really important. And obviously work providers will be able to support with that. And because there are some variations between those states and territories, there is that balance of actually making sure what you're authorised to treat and what's not. Mostly practitioners are authorised to draw up adrenaline from an ampule, provided they're trained and confident to do so. But there are other jurisdictions, I believe Queensland and Tasmania, where there are restrictions that adrenaline can only be administered via an auto-injector or a similar single-use device. So you have to go back to your jurisdictions as well. We do know that this is a major shift, but we also believe that it's a really important one, and we're here to try and help that transition. And it is complicated because of the different jurisdictions, but we do certainly want to make sure that practitioners do their research, talk to their provider and get on board with the capabilities.
Yeah, so you've kind of semi-answered my next question, which is good because it means we're on the same page. Let me just give you a couple of examples that might come up that I kind of just want to clarify here. So example number one is I work at a hospital where the policy forbids radiographers from injecting adrenaline. Does the hospital policy need to change?
Oh, this is a really great question.
Particularly if the state legislation says that they can and the capabilities say that they can or that they should, what should the hospital policy do?
Yeah, great question. This one is coming up a lot. The board does not play a role in recommendations for workplace policy. Well, that is not our area of jurisdiction either. But what we do say is there's a difference between what your policy says you can and you can't do versus what you should be capable and competent to do. So the professional capabilities expect that practitioners are capable and competent to perform it, but part of their employment agreement is they will have to actually abide by those hospital policies, and certainly they need to ensure those policies also have the support that enables escalation in the event of deterioration or anaphylaxis. So the two should be absolutely distinct from each other. One is around a policy, one is around the expectations of being capable and competent to be able to actually respond.
I guess then if I worked in a hospital, the policy was that we're not allowed to inject adrenaline, then we don't do it. But if the policy at that hospital were to change, not as a result of anything else, but just that they decided to change that policy, then the expectation would be that they do it.
Absolutely. And they also, as a healthcare provider, obviously have to follow the National Safety Quality Health Service standards. And that also has a requirement around responding to deteriorating patients. Of course, as an MRP, we fit as part of that professional practice as well, a multidisciplinary team. And we then therefore would have an expectation about responding in that if the policy said that we were able to do so and you were competent to perform that.
Yeah. Okay. Next example, number two. I'm in CT and I have a patient who has an adverse contrast reaction. If I inject adrenaline and I'm authorised to by my state health department, but I do not have the appropriate training, could I potentially receive an MRPBA notification for my actions?
Yes, you can. The requirement is that you're trained and competent to be able to perform that administration. If you are not trained and competent, you are not meeting that standard and you are not meeting the minimum requirements of your registration and your practice, and therefore that could actually trigger a notification.
Right, thank you. Let's get on to some of the other changes to these capabilities. Can you run us through some of these other changes?
Yeah, absolutely. There's also the inclusion of the role that we play in providing safe care and reducing family, domestic and sexual violence. And that's really going to be across all health professions. That's, again, if we think about the expectation from a member of the public, they look at health professionals as being able to support their journey, and that can be a broad journey. We do have some updates in there around MRP's ability to recognise perhaps some of the concerns. And
I'm just going to interject there. I do actually really like that one has been included in that. And the reason why is because as medical radiation professionals, we're often the first person that is alone with a patient who could disclose something like that, in which case then what's our training going to be in order to be able to recognise that and to be able to respond to that situation as well?
Yeah, and look, this isn't new. You've just highlighted that. This is something that we do have the privilege of being quite close with our patients in all of the three areas of radiation therapy, nuclear medicine and diagnostic radiography. And that's an absolute privilege. But those patients also see it potentially as that opportunity. When we actually say things like, oh, good morning, how was your day? What are you here for? Sometimes that can be like the door that opens up for them. And what a privilege to be a health professional standing in that spot. So it's important that MRPs actually understand the role in perhaps like just the identifying and alerting others and referring the patient on to others who may be able to assist. And as it is becoming a growing expectation on health service providers to be able to support family, domestic and sexual violence victims, there should be resources in your workplace to be able to support that.
Yeah, absolutely. So what about some of these other changes with respect to, say, digital health, for example?
Yeah, well, we do realise that our profession is evolving rapidly in the digital space. So obviously we want to make sure that when MRPs are applying digital health within their practice, that they're actually doing so in a responsible way and understanding the limitations of it, or also those that might have unintended consequences. So when we think about AI, we've got to actually understand things around what AI tools are being used. Do we have the appropriate informed consent? As practitioners, we cannot be ignorant to that. So the professional capabilities are really calling those out now and supporting them with some additional definitions as well.
Yep.
Further to that, we've got things like regrouping of modalities with CT being consistently described and that is applicable across all of those divisions.
Yep.
We've updated some of the descriptions on mammography and angiography, and also support for workplace teaching and learning and assessment for registered practitioners and future graduates. So there's a whole piece in there which is clearly articulated in Domain 4, which is really great.
Yep, wonderful. So for the individual, what do you think most people will need to do as a result of these updates that they don't currently do?
Absolutely. We did actually send out some comms in November. If you haven't seen it, please check your emails. But really, you really do need to read through the updated professional capabilities document to understand those changes that apply to your practice. We've discussed some of the potential additional training and learnings that you will need to do to be able to meet that by the 30th of March. And obviously review your professional indemnity insurance and make sure that those arrangements are aligned to your scope of practice. But importantly, implementing updated capabilities isn't just the role of obviously the medical radiation practitioner, but it also requires all stakeholders, and that includes employers. So those all need to be actually looked at in line with your registration. Is that role actually being expanded? Do you undertake a clinical educator role within your workplace? And what do these professional capabilities mean to those skills and parts of your role?
Yeah, I note that in the release of the new capabilities, there was also some other documents that support some of these changes, and this includes the implementation of responding to anaphylaxis. But there was also one around supporting the new graduate, following graduation, recognising that graduates actually take time to develop into experts. Is the intention of this particular document to be for the graduate or for the workplace or both?
Actually both. So it is actually important for graduates to be ready to start their practice. We know that they're at the very beginning part of their career, and it's important to recognise what that journey looks like and taking it seriously. The graduates also have to know their limits, and they also need to invest in their learning in those new environments. They've got to also adapt to new protocols and new ways of delivering their services. So it's a whole new world. But then there's also the obligation on those experienced practitioners to be able to support that. They've got to help guide, and that's important part of building a really good, robust workforce, as well as that great culture in the workplace.
Yeah. And of course, there's also the supporting document that looks at the implementation of the leadership and stewardship capabilities, which is Domain 6. And that also includes some of the examples of how the MRPBA sees that domain coming into it. But there's also one about peer learning and development. So let's clarify a couple of things in here. With peer learning, are we referring to all forms of learning from anyone?
Yeah, absolutely. We learn in different ways from different people and particularly also in different circumstances. And it's also how they continue to develop their roles as educators. If you're taking on that role through their own learning and development, that supports improving outcomes for those that we have the privilege to teach and to mentor. But usually we learn new skills or knowledge from people that are more experienced than us, but occasionally we do learn from others that are less experienced than us. And I'll sort of revert back to that great example at the ASMET Student Conference where, I sat there and I did learn. And I think that as experienced practitioners, we also have to take down some of those barriers to say, why can't we learn from those who are less experienced? We do fall in the trap of saying, oh, well, I've got the years of experience, I know what I'm doing. But sometimes we need to also just, take on board and listen to what others are actually telling us.
I think you're right. And I think one of the things that I really loved about being a clinical educator when I was the amount of times I actually had students that would actually teach me different ways of doing things and keeping that open mind rather than just, you've got to do it the way that I want you to do it. It was more that I had to be very open-minded in terms of how they would want it and that. So I guess it's that on top of the fact that we're not just thinking about a graduate learning from someone with 2 years of experience or a student learning from a graduate. We're talking about all forms of learning, really, aren't we?
Oh, absolutely. And think about the student's journey in that final year. They are going to multiple sites, spending a whole bunch of time with a huge number of medical radiation practitioners. They're actually getting so much more observational education than what we do as experienced practitioners, perhaps being in one place at one time and only going to a conference where we're hearing different ways of doing things, different protocols, different research. So we should not turn our back on those graduates coming out and what they've been exposed to in their education journey.
Yeah. I think I'd also like to stress here that whether we like it or not, students are always going to naturally gravitate to the graduates and the early career professionals simply because they can relate to them better through being closer in age or even just that they know this person understands them better because they went through uni more recently than the older ones did. So part of the professional capabilities is that students need to be able to demonstrate these in order to graduate, which means that universities are meant to develop and adapt their courses to these changes. So I have a couple of questions about this. What do you think the expectation will be on the universities to implement these changes? And will they need to do this by March the 30th?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. You're really on fire today. Yeah, absolutely. The universities will need to revise their programs, if not already done so. Remember, the professional capabilities is really to keep contemporary with practice. So some education providers may have a lot of this embedded in their programs already. So this is not going to be new to them. It might just be that they're aligning it to a different domain or duplicating it across domains when they're looking at their accreditation. But they'll need to actually make sure they're looking at those learning outcomes, which is what you're talking about, which is how do we actually know that what we're delivering in our program is going to meet those professional capabilities as learning outcomes. And they're well versed at this. This is not new to education providers. They will need to make sure that they've got those wheels in motion by the 30th of March because that's when the expectation comes out. But of course, programs have already commenced before the 30th of March. They're not expected to have those professional capabilities before 30th of March. It's actually about those graduates actually meeting those learning outcomes when they graduate. So throughout this year, there will be a lot of review across academic programs, but equally looking at what are those learning outcomes for graduates. And those that are coming out in mid-year will certainly make sure that they're supported if there is any concerns. And that's where contacting us, if the education providers will contact us if they've got concerns.
Yeah, okay. Now, I'm sure that there is people out there who provided their own recommendations for changes to the capabilities when we went to that public consultation, or they might have even given some feedback when the draft was released. And some of the people may have felt that they weren't listened to. So this is your chance now to respond to these people as to why they may feel that way.
Oh, absolutely. And look, we just have to firstly say thank you so much for everyone who did provide feedback. This is your profession. You gave feedback because you're in or connected to the profession and you really wanted to play a role in the development of that next edition of the capability. So we do really thank you. There is a lot of effort that goes into responding to consultations as well, so we do acknowledge that. But I suppose at a starting point, the board did start this with the view of protecting the public. So some of the feedback might have been aspirational, it may not have been relevant, or some of it might have had some unintended consequences if we were to actually include it. So they may have been coming from an isolated view we've interrogated that feedback, and then we've looked at whether that will have an impact. But certainly that process of the review, it did take a huge amount of time. That's why I sort of scoffed when you said, we'll probably have to start the process again. We did actually have a lot of research that went into it, which was independent. And then we obviously had the consultation, and then we reviewed all of that feedback in the consultation. We had independent committees with representatives from all the divisions having a look at all of that, and a lot of changes did happen along the way, but you won't see those in the final version. But certainly we do take a lot of effort in analysing it. We do compare and contrast the various pieces of the feedback, and certainly not every piece of feedback did get action, but we also say that the professional capabilities will evolve. So it will feel like that the ink is barely dried and we'll be starting again. So if it was really passionate to you and you feel that there wasn't an uptake, please get in contact with us, because it is iterative. So this is not the only time.
Yeah, great. Now, Cara, I'm done drilling you with all the questions, and I really want to thank you for joining me today, flying all the way over from Adelaide to talk through these new capabilities. It's a massive undertaking to review them all and to go through all of those consultation methods, and I can't begin to imagine how big that process actually was for you and your team. So just to finish off, where can people find the new capabilities and supporting documents, and who can they contact if there's any questions?
Yeah, look, thank you. I actually tested this just before coming in. If you just Google MRPBA, that's a good start. You could even Google MRPBA Professional Capabilities, and that will get you there. So if you get to our MRPBA website, on APRA's website, then you go to the menu, and there is a menu drop down for our standards.
Yep.
All you need to think and remember, our standards. And if you go into that, you'll find everything. But if that doesn't answer your questions, there is an email for us, which is mrpba@apra.gov.au. So you can always email us and we can try and assist you. Obviously, I know that there's a lot of resources out there. We'll be at ASMA in Hobart.
Yep.
We'll have a booth there. Great time for you to also come and chat to us. If there's other burning questions or feedback, we're here, we're listening. This is your profession, and we're trying to keep contemporary with your profession. And the professional capabilities is really just trying to keep up with what you're already doing. So we're here to take on your feedback. But I just want to say thanks, Steve, for the privilege of coming and speaking to you and your audience. Is a great opportunity for us to actually share a lot more of the insights behind the capabilities. We do think it's an amazing profession, and we hope that the capabilities is actually helping you to be the best that you can be.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much again for coming, Cara. Thanks for listening to RadPod, a podcast produced by the Australian Society of Medical Imaging and Radiation Therapy.